Adopted daughter discovers her boss is her birth mother through a coffee tasting test. The final decision involves an old cup. Hello, welcome, leave a like, subscribe, activate notifications, and enjoy this story. In the aromatic world of specialty coffee, a young intern's extraordinary palate unlocks a bittersweet mystery that's been brewing for decades. As the steam rises from an ancient cup, so do secrets that will forever change the lives of two women connected by more than just their love for coffee. The aroma of freshly ground coffee beans permeated the air as Zoe Matthews hustled through the sleek, modern lobby of the Caffeine Innovation Institute. Her heart raced, partly from the 3 shots of espresso she downed that morning, but mostly from the excitement of her first day as an intern at the most prestigious coffee research facility in the country. At 22, Zoe was a prodigy in the world of coffee. Her uncanny ability to discern the subtlest notes in any brew had earned her a full scholarship to the nation's top culinary program, where she'd specialized in coffee studies. Now, standing in the atrium of the CII, surrounded by state-of-the-art equipment and the buzz of scientific chatter, she felt like she'd finally found her place in the world. Zoe Matthews? A crisp voice cut through her reverie. Zoe turned to see a tall, elegant woman with salt and pepper hair pulled back into a severe bun. Her piercing blue eyes seemed to look right through Zoe, making her feel simultaneously seen and invisible. "Yes, that's me," Zoe replied, trying to keep the tremor out of her voice. "I'm Dr. Eleanor Blackwell, director of the Institute. Welcome to CII." Dr. Blackwell's handshake was firm, her smile polite but distant. "Follow me. We have a lot to cover, and I don't like to waste time." As they walked through the facility, Dr. Blackwell rattled off facts about the Institute's groundbreaking research, but Zoe found herself distracted by the woman's presence. There was something oddly familiar about her, like a half-remembered dream or the lingering notes of a complex espresso. "You come highly recommended, Ms. Matthews," Dr. Blackwell said as they entered her office. "Your paper on the impact of soil microbiota on coffee flavor profiles was intriguing." Zoe beamed with pride. "Thank you, Dr. Blackwell. I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to work here and contribute to your research." Dr. Blackwell's eyes narrowed slightly. "Yes, well, we'll see how you perform in practice. Theory is one thing, Ms. Matthews. Application is quite another." The director's cool demeanor sent a chill down Zoe's spine, reminding her of the many foster homes she'd cycled through before finding her forever family at age 7. The Matthews had given her love, stability, and encouraged her passion for coffee. But standing here now, Zoe felt that old, familiar urge to prove herself worthy. "Now," Dr. Blackwell continued, "we're currently working on a classified project involving a newly discovered coffee varietal. Your primary task will be assisting with our blind taste tests. We believe this new strain could revolutionize the industry, but we need to ensure our results are reproducible." Zoe nodded eagerly. "I understand, Dr. Blackwell. You can count on me." As Dr. Blackwell led her to the tasting lab, Zoe couldn't shake the feeling that she was stepping into something far bigger than she'd anticipated. The Institute's sterile white halls seemed to whisper with secrets, and even the rich scent of coffee carried an undercurrent of mystery. Little did Zoe know that the cup of coffee waiting for her in that lab would be the key to unlocking a past she never knew she had, a past inextricably linked to the very woman who now held her future in her hands. The tasting lab was a coffee lover's paradise. Gleaming machines lined the walls, their dials and levers promising the perfect brew. In the center of the room stood a large, round table with several cupping sets arranged in a neat circle. "All right, people, let's begin," Dr. Blackwell announced to the small group of researchers gathered around the table. "As you know, we're continuing our analysis of strain X427. Today, we're focusing on how different roasting temperatures affect its flavor profile." Zoe took her place at the table, trying to calm her nerves. This was what she was born to do. She'd been identifying coffee varietals blindfolded since she was 12. But something about Dr. Blackwell's intense gaze made her second-guess herself. "Ms. Matthews," Dr. Blackwell said, her tone sharp, "since you're our new prodigy, why don't you start us off?" Zoe nodded, taking a deep breath. She leaned in, inhaling the aroma of the first cup. The scent was unlike anything she'd encountered before. Notes of jasmine and honeysuckle mingled with something earthy and almost familiar. As she took her first sip, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. Flavors exploded across her palate: bright citrus, smooth chocolate, a hint of spice. But beneath it all was a taste she couldn't quite place, something that tugged at the edges of her memory. "Well?" Dr. Blackwell prompted, her pen poised over a notepad. Zoe cleared her throat. "It's extraordinary. There's a complexity here I've never encountered before. The top notes are floral jasmine, primarily with a citrusy brightness. Mid-palate, I'm getting dark chocolate and a hint of cardamom. But the finish," she paused, frowning. "The finish is unusual. There's something there I can't quite identify. It's almost nostalgic." Dr. Blackwell's eyebrows shot up. "Nostalgic? That's not a flavor profile, Ms. Matthews." "I know, I'm sorry," Zoe stammered. "It's just, there's something about this coffee that feels familiar, like a memory I can't quite grasp." The director's expression was unreadable. "Interesting. Continue with the other samples, please." As Zoe worked her way through the remaining cups, that elusive flavor lingered on her tongue and in her mind. Each sip seemed to bring her closer to something just out of reach, like a word on the tip of her tongue. By the time she finished, Zoe felt drained and oddly emotional. Her detailed notes on each sample's flavor profile were impeccable, but that nagging sense of familiarity refused to leave her. "Excellent work, everyone," Dr. Blackwell said, collecting the notepads. "Ms. Matthews, a word in my office, please." Zoe followed Dr. Blackwell, her stomach churning with a mix of pride and apprehension. As they entered the office, she noticed something she'd missed earlier: a small, antique coffee cup displayed in a glass case on the bookshelf. "Your palate is as impressive as your recommendation suggested," Dr. Blackwell began, settling behind her desk. "But I'm particularly intrigued by your reaction to the first sample. You said it felt nostalgic?" Zoe nodded, her eyes drawn to the old cup. "Yes, I can't explain it. There was just something about that flavor that felt like coming home." Dr. Blackwell's gaze followed Zoe's to the display case. For a moment, her cool demeanor seemed to crack, a flash of something: pain, longing, crossing her face. "That cup?" Zoe said, unable to stop herself. "It's beautiful. Is it significant to your research?" Dr. Blackwell was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was softer than Zoe had yet heard it. "It's a family heirloom. My mother's. She used to say that the secret to a perfect cup of coffee wasn't in the beans or the brew, but in the love you poured into it." The words hit Zoe like a jolt of electricity. She'd heard that phrase before, in a dream or a distant memory. But before she could process it, Dr. Blackwell's professional mask slipped back into place. "That will be all for today, Ms. Matthews. I expect a full report on your taste test findings on my desk first thing tomorrow." As Zoe left the office, her mind was reeling. The mysterious coffee, Dr. Blackwell's strange reaction, the oddly familiar phrase. It all swirled together like grounds in a French press, promising a revelation she wasn't sure she was ready for. Little did she know, the true test was yet to come, and it would require her to brew up every ounce of courage she possessed. The following week passed in a caffeine-fueled blur for Zoe. Each day brought new tests, new flavors, and new mysteries. She threw herself into her work, impressing her colleagues with her keen palate and insightful observations. But beneath her professional exterior, a storm was brewing. Every night, Zoe found herself haunted by vivid dreams. Fragments of memory danced just out of reach: the scent of freshly ground coffee, a woman's gentle laugh, the warmth of a cup cradled in small hands. She'd wake gasping, the phantom taste of that nostalgic brew lingering on her tongue. On Friday afternoon, as golden sunlight slanted through the lab windows, Dr. Blackwell made an announcement that sent a ripple of excitement through the team. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're entering the final phase of our Strain X 427 trials," she said, her eyes gleaming with an intensity that made Zoe shiver. Next week, we'll be conducting a series of extended taste tests to analyze how the coffee's flavor profile develops over time. As the other researchers chatted excitedly, Dr. Blackwell approached Zoe. "Ms. Matthews, I'd like you to lead the first session. Your unique perspective could prove valuable." Zoe nodded, a mix of pride and apprehension swirling in her stomach. "Of course, Dr. Blackwell. I'd be honored." Later that evening, as Zoe was packing up to leave, she noticed Dr. Blackwell still in her office, hunched over her desk. The usually composed director looked troubled. Before she could stop herself, Zoe knocked on the open door. "Dr. Blackwell, is everything all right?" The older woman started, quickly shuffling some papers out of sight. "Ms. Matthews, I didn't realize you were still here." "I was just leaving," Zoe said, hesitating. "I couldn't help but notice." "Is something wrong?" Dr. Blackwell's eyes flicked to the antique cup on her shelf, then back to Zoe. For a moment, she looked on the verge of saying something, but then her professional mask slipped back into place. "Nothing to concern yourself with," she said briskly. "Have a good weekend, Ms. Matthews. I expect you bright and early on Monday." As Zoe left the building, she couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was percolating beneath the surface. Little did she know, Monday's taste test would be the catalyst for a revelation that would change both their lives forever. Monday morning dawned crisp and clear, the kind of fall day that begged for a steaming mug of coffee and contemplation. But as Zoe entered the CII, her mind was far from peaceful. The weekend had brought more vivid dreams, leaving her feeling raw and on edge. The tasting lab was hushed as Zoe set up for the extended flavor profile test. She arranged the cupping sets with practiced ease, her hands steady even as her heart raced. As her colleagues filtered in, Zoe caught sight of Dr. Blackwell hovering in the doorway, her face uncharacteristically pale. "Let's begin," Zoe said, her voice stronger than she felt. "We'll be tasting Strain X 427 at 5-minute intervals over the next hour to track how its flavor evolves as it cools." The first round of tasting went smoothly. Zoe led the team through their observations, noting the coffee's bright acidity and complex fruit notes. But as they approached the 15-minute mark, something shifted. Zoe lifted the cup to her lips, inhaling deeply. The aroma hit her like a lightning bolt, rich and familiar, carrying with it a flood of fractured memories. A sunny kitchen, a woman's laugh, the clinking of a spoon against porcelain. She took a sip and the world fell away. Suddenly, Zoe was no longer in the sterile lab. She was a toddler, perched on a warm lap, tiny hands wrapped around a large mug. A soft voice was singing, the words lost but the melody achingly familiar. The taste of sweetened coffee lingered on her tongue, a special treat, a moment of connection. "Zoe? Ms. Matthews." Dr. Blackwell's sharp voice snapped Zoe back to reality. She blinked, realizing her cheeks were wet with tears. The entire lab was staring at her in confusion and concern. I'm sorry," Zoe stammered, her voice shaking. "I don't know what came over me." Dr. Blackwell's face was a mask of barely contained emotion. "Perhaps we should take a break. Everyone, please give Ms. Matthews some space." As the other researchers filed out, casting curious glances over their shoulders, Dr. Blackwell approached Zoe. For the first time since they'd met, the director's cool demeanor had cracked completely, revealing a vulnerability that made her seem suddenly human. "Zoe," she said softly, using her first name for the first time, "what did you experience just now?" Zoe took a shuddering breath. I remembered something, a memory I didn't know I had. I was very young, sitting with my mother, I think. We were sharing coffee. She was singing to me." She looked up at Dr. Blackwell, confusion etched across her face. "But that's impossible. I was adopted when I was 7. I don't have any memories from before then." Dr. Blackwell's hand trembled as she reached for the cup Zoe had been drinking from. She inhaled deeply, her eyes closing as if in pain. When she opened them again, they were shining with unshed tears. "This coffee," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Strain X 427 is not just any new varietal. It's a recreation of a strain that was thought to be extinct. A strain that my mother used to grow. Zoe felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Your mother? Dr. Blackwell nodded, her composure crumbling. Zoe, there's something I need to tell you. Something I've been trying to find the courage to say since the moment you walked into this institute. She took a deep, shaking breath. That memory you just experienced? It wasn't impossible. Because I'm your birth mother. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with decades of secrets and lost time. Zoe stared at Dr. Blackwell, at her mother, feeling as though she was seeing her clearly for the first time. The familiar blue eyes, the set of her jaw, the way she held herself, all mirrors of Zoe's own features. As the full weight of the revelation settled over them, both women knew that nothing would ever be the same. The taste of Strain X, 427, lingered on their tongues, bitter and sweet, much like the journey that lay ahead of them. The lab fell silent, save for the gentle hum of machines and the pounding of Zoe's heart in her ears. She stared at Dr. Blackwell, Eleanor, her mind reeling as it tried to reconcile the stern director with the mother from her long-buried memories. I don't understand, Zoe finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Why? How? Eleanor's composure, always so impeccable, crumbled entirely. She sank into a nearby chair, her hands trembling as she reached for the antique coffee cup she'd brought from her office. It's a long story, Zoe, she said, her voice thick with emotion. One I've rehearsed 1,000 times in my head, but never found the courage to tell. As Eleanor began to speak, the sterile lab seemed to fade away, replaced by the ghost of a small coffee farm in the mountains of Colombia, over 2 decades ago. I was young, Eleanor said, her eyes distant, barely out of college, full of dreams about revolutionizing the coffee industry. I went to Colombia to study rare coffee varietals and fell in love with the country, with the coffee, and with a local farmer named Mateo. Zoe listened, transfixed, as Eleanor painted a picture of a whirlwind romance, of nights spent discussing the perfect roast under star-filled skies, of plans for a future filled with love and the richest coffee the world had ever tasted. When I found out I was pregnant with you, I was overjoyed, Eleanor continued, her voice breaking. Mateo and I married in a small ceremony on the farm. We were going to raise you there, surrounded by coffee plants and love. But then, Eleanor's knuckles whitened around the old cup. There was an accident, a landslide. Mateo, your father, he didn't survive. Zoe felt tears streaming down her face, mourning a father she'd never known. What happened then? She asked softly. Eleanor took a shuddering breath. I was devastated, lost. The farm was destroyed, and with it all our dreams. I couldn't bear to stay, but I had nowhere else to go. My parents had disowned me when I left for Colombia. I came back to the States with you, but I was barely holding it together. She looked at Zoe, her eyes pleading for understanding. I tried, Zoe. For 7 years, I tried to be the mother you deserved. But the grief, the pressure, it was too much. I was spiraling, and I knew you deserved better than what I could give you. Zoe's mind flashed to fragmented memories, a warm laugh, the scent of coffee, a sense of safety, but also raised voices, slamming doors, long silences. So you gave me up, she said, her voice barely audible. Eleanor nodded, tears flowing freely now. It was the hardest decision I've ever made, but I knew you needed stability, love, a chance at a normal life, something I couldn't provide then. But why didn't you ever contact me? Zoe asked, a hint of anger creeping into her voice. Why wait until now? Eleanor's gaze dropped to the antique cup in her hands. Fear, she admitted. Shame. As the years passed, it became harder and harder to imagine how to bridge that gap. I threw myself into my work, trying to recreate the coffee varietal your father and I had been developing. I told myself that when I succeeded, I'd find you, explain everything. She gestured to the cooling cups of Strain X 427 on the table. This coffee, Zoe, is not just any strain. It's your heritage, the culmination of your father's work and mine. When I saw your application, saw your passion for coffee, I knew it was time, but I was a coward. I couldn't find the words. Zoe sat in stunned silence, trying to process the flood of information. Part of her wanted to scream, to rage against the years of separation. Another part yearned to embrace the mother she'd always wondered about. But mostly, she felt numb, overwhelmed by the weight of secrets finally revealed. I need some air, Zoe said abruptly, standing up so quickly her chair clattered to the floor. Eleanor reached out as if to stop her, then let her hand fall. Of course, she said softly. Take all the time you need. I'll be here if you want to talk more. Zoe nodded stiffly and fled the lab, leaving behind a mother lost and found, and cups of cooling coffee that tasted of a bittersweet past. The crisp autumn air hit Zoe like a slap as she burst out of the institute's doors. She gulped it down, trying to clear her head of the dizzying revelations. Her feet carried her without conscious thought, and soon she found herself in a small park across the street. Collapsing onto a bench, Zoe buried her face in her hands. Emotions warred within her: anger at the years of separation, confusion over her newly discovered heritage, an aching sadness for the father she'd never know. And beneath it all, a tiny spark of hope she wasn't sure she was ready to acknowledge. As the initial shock began to subside, questions bubbled up like grounds in a French press. Why had Eleanor chosen now to reveal the truth? What did this mean for Zoe's relationship with her adoptive parents? And most pressingly, what happened next? Zoe's phone buzzed in her pocket. A text from her adoptive mother, asking how her day was going. The simple message brought fresh tears to Zoe's eyes. These were the people who had loved her, supported her, nurtured her passion for coffee. How could she tell them about this? As the afternoon light began to fade, Zoe realized she'd been sitting in the park for hours. Her colleagues must be wondering what had happened. Eleanor, her birth mother, must be worried sick. With a deep breath, Zoe stood up. She wasn't ready to face Eleanor again. Not yet. But she couldn't avoid this forever. She needed more information, more time to process. And she realized with a start, she needed to taste that coffee again. Steeling herself, Zoe walked back to the institute. The labs were quiet, most of the staff having gone home for the day, but a light still burned in Eleanor's office. Zoe hesitated outside the door, her hand raised to knock. Through the frosted glass, she could see Eleanor's silhouette, hunched over her desk. Even from here, Zoe could sense the weight of guilt and anticipation radiating from the woman who had given her life. Before she could lose her nerve, Zoe knocked. The sharp sound echoed through the empty hallway. "Come in," Eleanor's voice called, a note of hope evident even through the door. Zoe stepped into the office, her eyes immediately drawn to the antique coffee cup still sitting on Eleanor's desk. In the soft lamplight, she could now see the delicate pattern etched into its surface, coffee plants in full bloom. Eleanor looked up, her eyes red-rimmed but cautiously hopeful. "Zoe," she breathed, "I wasn't sure you'd come back." "I'm not sure about anything right now," Zoe admitted, "but I have questions." And she hesitated, then plunged ahead. "And I want to taste the coffee again, properly this time." A small smile tugged at Eleanor's lips. "Of course," she said, standing up. "Shall we go to the lab?" As they walked to the tasting room, an awkward silence stretched between them. This morning they had been mentor and protege. Now, they were strangers with a shared past, trying to navigate uncharted waters. In the lab, Eleanor began the ritual of preparing the coffee with practiced ease. Zoe watched, noticing for the first time how similar their movements were. The way they both inhaled the aroma with the same slight tilt of the head. As the rich scent of strain X 427 filled the air, Zoe felt a sense of déjà vu. But this time, instead of being overwhelmed by the rush of memories, she was prepared. Eleanor handed her a cup, their fingers brushing momentarily. "Take your time," she said softly. "Really experience it." Zoe nodded, cradling the warm cup in her hands. She closed her eyes and breathed in deeply, letting the complex aroma wash over her. Then slowly she took a sip. The flavors bloomed on her tongue, bright citrus, deep chocolate, a hint of spice. But now, knowing its origin, Zoe could taste something more. The terroir of a Colombian mountainside. The legacy of a father she'd never known. The love and pain of the mother who had let her go. When Zoe opened her eyes, they were brimming with tears. She looked at Eleanor, seeing her own emotions reflected back. "It tastes like home," Zoe whispered. "A home I never knew I had." Eleanor nodded, her own cup trembling slightly in her hands. "It's your heritage, Zoe, your father's dream and mine. And now, perhaps, it could be yours too." As they sat there, sipping coffee that tasted of lost time and new beginnings, Zoe realized that this was just the first step on a long and complex journey. There would be hard conversations ahead, bridges to rebuild, and wounds to heal. But with each sip of Strain X427, a small seed of hope took root. Perhaps, like the rare coffee they both loved, something beautiful could grow from these bitter grounds. The following weeks were a whirlwind of emotions and revelations for Zoe. By day, she threw herself into her work at the Institute, diving deeper into the complexities of Strain X427. By night, she engaged in long, often tearful conversations with Eleanor, piecing together the puzzle of her past. As autumn leaves fell outside the lab windows, Zoe learned about her father, Mateo. Eleanor shared photos of a man with Zoe's warm brown eyes and easy smile. She told stories of his passion for coffee, his dreams of creating the perfect brew, and the love that had blossomed between them on that remote Colombian farm. "He would have adored you," Eleanor said one evening, her voice thick with emotion. "He used to talk to you for hours while you were still in my belly, telling you all about the coffee plants and his plans for the future." Zoe fingered the worn photograph, trying to imagine the father she'd never know. "What was his favorite type of coffee?" she asked softly. Eleanor's eyes lit up. "He loved experimenting, but he always came back to a perfectly roasted Colombian Supremo. He said it was like tasting sunshine." These moments of connection were interspersed with periods of anger and confusion. Zoe grappled with the years of separation, the what-ifs and might-have-beens. There were days when she could barely look at Eleanor, the pain of abandonment too raw. Through it all, Strain X427 became a touchstone for both women. Each tasting session was like opening a time capsule, unlocking new memories and emotions. Zoe found herself able to distinguish subtle notes that spoke of her heritage, a hint of the Colombian soil where she was conceived, a whisper of the love that had created her. As they worked to refine the strain, Zoe and Eleanor began to rebuild their relationship, one cup at a time. The language of coffee became a bridge between them, allowing them to express feelings too complex for words alone. But even as Zoe grew closer to her birth mother, she struggled with how to share this news with her adoptive parents. The Matthews had given her a loving home, nurtured her passion for coffee, and supported her every step of the way. The thought of hurting them was almost unbearable. Finally, after weeks of internal debate, Zoe decided it was time. She invited her adoptive parents to visit her at the Institute, her stomach churning with nerves as she prepared to reveal the truth. The day of their visit dawned clear and crisp. Zoe paced the lab, checking and rechecking the coffee preparation station. Eleanor hovered nearby, her usual composure fractured by anxiety. "Are you sure you want me here for this?" Eleanor asked for the 100th time. "I can make myself scarce if you'd prefer to tell them alone." Zoe shook her head. "No, I need you here. We're in this together now, for better or worse." As the Matthews entered the lab, their faces beaming with pride at their daughter's accomplishments, Zoe felt a wave of love and guilt wash over her. How could she do this to them? But as she looked from her adoptive parents to Eleanor, she realized that love wasn't a finite resource. Her heart had enough room for all of them, the parents who had chosen her, and the mother who had been forced to let her go. Taking a deep breath, Zoe began to speak. "Mom, Dad, there's something I need to tell you, and someone I need you to meet." The revelation hit the Matthews like a thunderbolt. Shock, confusion, and hurt played across their faces as Zoe explained the situation, her voice trembling but determined. Eleanor stood silently by, her presence a testament to the truth of Zoe's words. I don't understand. Zoe's adoptive mother, Linda, said, her voice barely above a whisper. Why now? After all these years? Zoe exchanged a glance with Eleanor, then turned back to her parents. It's complicated, she said softly, but I think it's best if I show you. With hands that shook only slightly, Zoe began the ritual of preparing strain X427. As the rich aroma filled the lab, she explained its significance, the lost Colombian varietal, the heritage it represented, the memories it had unlocked. This coffee, Zoe said, it's a part of me I never knew existed, and in discovering it, I found a piece of myself I didn't know was missing. She handed cups to her adoptive parents and Eleanor, then took one for herself. I'd like us all to taste it together, she said, to understand. For a long moment, the only sound in the lab was the gentle slurping of coffee. Zoe watched anxiously as emotions played across the faces of the people she loved most in the world. Her adoptive father, John, was the first to speak. It's extraordinary, he said, looking at Zoe with wonder. I can taste your passion in every sip. Linda nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. It's like tasting your soul, sweetheart. All the love and complexity that makes you who you are. Eleanor set her cup down gently. Mr. and Mrs. Matthews, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I can never thank you enough for giving Zoe the love and support I couldn't provide. You raised an incredible young woman. The tension in the room began to dissipate, replaced by a cautious understanding. As they talked about the past, the present, and the uncertain future, Zoe felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. It wouldn't be easy, she knew. There would be more difficult conversations ahead, more emotions to navigate. But in this moment, surrounded by the people who loved her and the coffee that had brought them together, she felt a sense of wholeness she'd never experienced before. As the afternoon light began to fade, Zoe excused herself for a moment. She walked to Eleanor's office, her eyes drawn to the antique coffee cup that had started it all. With gentle hands, she lifted it from its display case and returned to the lab. I think, she said, her voice soft but sure, it's time for this cup to be used again. Eleanor's eyes widened in recognition. Zoe, are you sure? That cup? It's been in my family for generations. Zoe nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. Exactly. And now, it's time for it to be part of a new family tradition. She carefully poured a measure of strain X427 into the antique cup, its rich color a beautiful contrast to the delicate porcelain. Then, with a deep breath, she placed it in the center of the table. This cup, Zoe said, looking at each of her parents in turn, represents my past, my present, and my future. The family I was born to, the family that chose me, and the family we can all be together. I'd like us to share it, if you're willing. For a moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, Linda reached out and took the cup. She took a small sip, then passed it to John. He did the same before handing it to Eleanor. Finally, it came to Zoe. As she raised the cup to her lips, Zoe felt a profound sense of rightness. The coffee was perfect, a blend of bitter and sweet, complex yet harmonious. Just like family, she thought. To new beginnings, Zoe said, raising the cup in a toast. And to the love that binds us all. As they echoed her words, their voices mingling like the notes in a perfect cup of coffee, Zoe knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. For in the end, love, like coffee, was meant to be shared. Thank you for listening until the end. Share your opinion about the story in the comments and let us know which character you liked the most. If this story touched you and you want to hear more, click on the next story appearing on your screen. Leave a like and subscribe to our channel so we can build a great community of people who share emotional stories together. Until the next story.